that required me in my proposal to create a bibliography of media of text that would inform my work. And so a very tangible idea that I had was that I wanted to, read a lot and come up with some books that I would be able to cite in my proposal and use to inform my own creative writing. Is it fixed?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Keep
Okay, sounds good. I also really wanted to challenge myself to read differently. I think creative writing is all about specificity. You're looking at one life, one narrative, or maybe a couple of lives and narratives, which is really different from other fields like the social sciences, which are concerned with overarching patterns and generalizations. And so for me to read for creative writing required me to read much more closely, pay more attention not just to what's happening, but how the author is making this happen and why they're making the choices that they're making. So I didn't want to just point at something and say, oh, this is the immigration story, but rather how is that story unfolding? How is it being told maybe in ways that maybe are different from how we typically understand immigration stories. And lastly, I wanted this project to really help me expand my network and allow me to reach out to other writers and faculty involved in this research, as well as other people who are interested in this topic. Yeah. And so, before I could even, begin the actual reading, I had to think a lot about what to read. And this was an opportunity for me to honestly reach out to people who I'd been meaning to reach out to, but never had the chance to. So for example, I spoke to Professor David Ng, who's done a lot of work in queer Asian American literature, and he was the one who actually recommended Munoz's book to me. I also spoke a lot to Piali Bhattacharya, who advised this project, and she gave me suggestions on how to even find texts that fell under the categories of Asian American women's literature. He referred me to other faculty members who didn't always respond to my requests, but that's okay because that's what happens in research, and it was still very helpful. And also in New York, I was in New York this summer, and there's a really vibrant literary community there, and so I paid a visit to You and Me Books, the Asian woman-owned bookstore in Chinatown, and spoke to the owner, and she gave me a list of reading suggestions that I was able to look at. And I was also there for an author debut event, so it was also really cool to, talk to other authors and hear what they were reading. Yeah. And then in addition to looking at texts, I also really wanted to contextualize them because if I'm reading about the present moment, I have to understand what the present moment means and entails. And so I also thought a lot about how I should go about doing this. I debated if I should read a lot more theory, if I should conduct formal interviews, and I decided on just having informal conversations with queer Asian American women and non-binary individuals between the ages of 18 and 24 that I met. And once again, because I'm studying creative writing, I'm not looking for specific patterns or overarching trends, but rather individual narratives and really understanding how each individual person was sort of experiencing life in this present moment. And the conversations generally centered around this question of if you could live another life, what would it look like? And recurring themes that came up in a lot of these answers were, people wanted to find new ways of self-expression through different realms of art or writing or dance. People want to feel more fully comfortable in their body and identity because we also exist in a moment where there are a lot of restrictions on what we can do with our bodies and how we can relate to people. There's a desire to find home in many places, various parts of the US, places abroad, and really understanding who is community. And there's also an impulse to return towards the past and maybe relive it and rethink, if the past was different, where would I be now? Where would I be in the future? And these are all themes that came up in Munoz's book as well as the text that I read. And so these were ideas that I was really bringing with me and keeping in the back of my mind as I was reading the books and trying to move forward in formulating a project. Yeah. And so now into the actual novels. So these are 9 books of text that I read prior to my project, during my project, as well as a few that I'm working on now and hope to read because I came across them recently. And in creating this selection, I also realized a lot of my prior readings skewed East Asian, and so I had to make a really concerted effort to find texts written by Southeast Asian and South Asian narratives. I also wanted like them all to be really different, and so some are magical, some are realistic, some are about rich people, some are not about rich people, some are also about humans, and others really like merge the distinction between human and animal, which is really interesting to read about. Because yeah, as I said, there's no one queer Asian American narrative, and I wanted to see what different stories could look like, how different authors really were really rethinking this genre, and what does it mean to sort of center these people and challenge our current understandings of sexuality, identity, and even storytelling. And so I will talk about two in particular. So the first is The Chosen and the Beautiful. This book was really cool. I'll talk about three things in particular. It's a reimagined The Great Gatsby. So it centers Jordan Baker, who like she's not one of like the pivotal characters of The Great Gatsby, but here she is the narrator and the core protagonist, and she is a queer Vietnamese American woman. And it's still set in 1920s New York, but there's an added element of magic. There are demons involved, there's the devil, there's like demon's blood, and they like drink it sometimes. Very interesting. And yeah, also a number of the characters like Gatsby and Nick Carraway are also queer. And so, like, I guess for me, I thought this was like even the, I guess, act of taking like a very classical piece of literature with like really rich white characters who do their little things and really reimagine it into something that's a completely different world, adding magical elements. I think it really took like, I guess, how I understand world building in creative writing to a different level, as well as what it means to even retell a story, because she's not ascribing to the original narratives. The only things in common are New York and the character names, and there's so much that's happening beyond. And yeah, so I think this book also really asks us like if you can really reimagine history, because it's set in the time of the 1920s, and there's a lot of like political xenophobic acts that's happening, and especially because my project is thinking about utopia. If we try to sort of rewrite the past or retell the past in a different way, how different of a world could it be? And so I will now go into like, I guess, sort of close readings on a few select passages of this book that stuck out to me in like the impulse towards utopia. And so the first one was a sex scene in the yard, and it was really bizarre to me when I read it at first, because it just kind of happened out of nowhere and I really wasn't expecting it. But like, I guess, yeah, I think I'll read a bit from it. But I guess there's this moment during good sex, at least, where you forget how you're meant to look or what you think a properly self-contained creature should look like. My hair was full of bits of bark. One of the garters had given up entirely, and I didn't even like to think of what my paint was doing on my face, but none of it mattered at all. And I think like why this passage really stuck out to me the more I thought about it was sort of the centering of Jordan's own sexuality and desire. And it's done in a really public and physical space, because like here she sees Gatsby's orchard, like they're outside when this is happening. And like I think all of the previous expectations upon her to be like an Asian American woman who's low-key like Daisy's sidekick and kept to the shadows. It was always Daisy's narrative that was being put forth, Daisy's love interest. And then for Jordan to come out here and really publicly have sex, I guess really challenged a lot of the way she was existing prior to this moment. Munoz in Cruising Utopia also writes a lot about how in this impulse for utopia, there's the desire to be able to, I guess, express and experience your desires and sexualities free of the state. He was writing about, like, I think the 1970s especially, there was a lot of criminalization of homosexuality and a lot of homophobia around. And so I thought this passage really connected me to that part of Cruising Utopia because like she just doesn't care about anything except her present immediate feelings. And that in itself, I think, was really powerful given how her narrative had been going prior. And then I guess other passages that I picked out were about Jordan's Asian identity. Her identity was given to us in bits and pieces, starting with the beginning. Okay, we're told she's exotic, but we're not told she's really Vietnamese until she meets Vietnamese people. And then we're only told that she's queer when she recounts her past lovers and mentions that there were women among them. And it's only until the end when we're told the colonial backstory of how she even ended up in the US. And so I thought that like slow reveal of identity really reflected how she was also coming to terms with her own identity throughout. Growing up in like East and West Egg around a lot of elite white people and how she was kind of tokenized and exoticized by a lot of her peers. And towards the end, she meets someone who has the same paper cutting powers where they make a paper silhouette and they bring it to life. She has that power, the other Asian characters do, and there's a sense of community that she feels with them. But she grapples a lot with sort of also the alienation that she feels and being disconnected from her Vietnamese identity, right? She's like, I feel less special in Chinatown. That's what made me dislike it. She always feels weird when she sees someone who shares like the same Asian features as her. But over time throughout the narrative, we see how she has a growing fascination and growing connection with this Asian community. And towards the end, when sort of the xenophobia in New York like hits a fever pitch, how she really negotiates where her community is and who they are. And so this realization that Daisy's friendship with her is not enough really allows her to challenge how she understands community. And it really grants Jordan the agency to think about who she wants to be around and who she keeps close to her, which was also a really profound part of the book. And now I'll talk about Bestiary by King Chang. This was also really cool, but it's also really abstract. So I just want to fair warn that for anyone who really wants to read it. You're going to need to read it multiple times. But it traces a family that moves from Taiwan to the US, and it's founded in mythology that spans across generations. We have characters called daughter, mother, and grandmother. And even naming the character this really emphasizes the lineage of women in the family and how mythology and trauma gets passed down from generation to generation. And so this novel is structured as fragmented vignettes. And already, because it's so fragmented, it really challenged us to think about, how do we tell a story? When there's scenes with daughter and then it's interspersed with mother and then also grandmother, a story doesn't need to be linear for it to make sense. It could be driven by a lot of other central themes and impulses. And it forces the reader to think a lot about these images that appear over and over again, and the reader then has to draw connections themselves. And so, I guess I want to talk about the novel structure. So in the second half, holes basically start appearing in her backyard. And whenever she feeds something into the holes, letters pop out. And these are interspersed letters that she begins to put together. And they tell her family history, basically. They're letters that were written by her grandmother. And I just want to showcase one of these letters. It's very fragmented. It's basically it's basically poetry at this point. I bury them in my yard, my bed. I mourn my bones that believe. Their home, the moon is down in your sisters, the stripes I wear. And I thought these passages, the letters in particular, were really poignant because this whole narrative was really about how a family comes to terms with their generational trauma and how the narrator herself is really thinking about what she inherited from her mother and her grandmother and how she can make sense of her life going forward. And so King Chang really challenges our conventional notions of how a sentence is supposed to move, how a narrative is supposed to be structured, because how can you convey trauma through a language that doesn't have the capacity to like really convey it. You know, what happens when language breaks down, and are there other ways that, you know, we can reshape language to really encapsulate like the difficulty of like drowning someone, for example. And because these are also letters that come from the ground, they're also missing some parts. They're not explicitly clear, and so daughter and her girlfriend Ben are basically trying to also like really fit together, and it also adds to the difficulty of communicating intergenerationally, especially when, you know, someone is unable to fully tell their story. And I guess a bit more about daughter and Ben. So daughter begins to grow a tiger tail around the time that she begins falling for her classmate Ben. And she's both afraid of the tail, but also attached to it, fearing the violence that comes with the mythology of Huguopo, who feeds on children's tails. And I think I was really struck by these passages in particular, because to me, they really made clear why Ming Chang even included this image of a tiger tail. She writes, like, there was also a hunger in me that was more than a body's. In this first passage and second one, Ben said I shouldn't be afraid of what the tail wanted me to do. You're becoming the species that will save you. But neither of us knew what I needed to be saved from. Neither of us knew what a beast was born to do. And here I was like thinking a lot about how Chang as a writer was really trying to find alternative ways to represent desire. Because she makes it explicitly clear that our current understandings of the body is just not enough to express what daughter is experiencing. There's this hunger that just, like, she just can't seem to control, and this body just can't seem to contain. And so she grows a tiger tail. And so desire also oscillates between being seen as something that is really monstrous and uncontrollable, because the violence of like feeding on children's toes is like pretty obvious. But it's also a way that she remains connected to her family, because she hears about these tales from her mother and her grandmother. And the image of the tiger tail also occurs in the older letters. Also, this tail is a big driver between her attraction to Ben, and the tail often, you know, like it starts moving around more intensely whenever she feels more attraction to Ben. And so, like, I'm not gonna spoil the ending. The ending shocked me, but I thought that the tale really represented that daughter's agency in choosing queerness, because in her previous generations, even if her mother and her grandmother were really grappling with this idea of sexuality and violence from men, she's the one who really has the tail and really has the agency to choose what she wants to do with it and how she wields it. And I think the fact that this is an image that is really threading a pretty disjointed series of narratives together also underscores the need for us to understand the past in order to think of the future, where the tale comes from in order for daughter to think about what she wants to do with it moving forward. Yeah. Okay. And so after all of this, where do we go from here? I guess for me, like where I'm going from here with this project, like I approached it with the goal to find books to include in my creative thesis proposal, which I submitted last week. Yay, I'm done with that. Thank you. Hopefully it gets accepted, and if it's not, that doesn't matter, I'm still writing it anyway. But obviously this reading project for me is an ongoing effort. Like I only had the time to talk about 2 books. There were 9 books that I showed on the slide prior, and there are more than 9 queer Asian American women's texts out there. And so I also want to use this to sort of provide the framework for me to continue reading in the future, how I can read more intentionally, as well as reach out to books that, you know, aren't typically in my orbit. But I also wanted to take away sort of a deeper and more generous understanding of how I relate with the world. And so I guess I wanted to provide a bit of context with this fellowship. So I received like my email, like congratulations, in early May, and it was on the same day that the draft to overturn Roe v. Wade was leaked. And that day, I think I really thought a lot about, you know, what did it mean for me to begin this project that, you know, investigated bodily autonomy and sexuality and freedom at a time when there was a lot of state authority regulating what people could do or can't do with their bodies in real life. And also, while I was working on this project over the summer, I was also working a pretty intense corporate job, which really forced me to find different ways to carve out time to sit down and read and to think about these ideas. And so in a way, this project was also a way for me to sort of like find my own utopia through reading and literature, one that existed separately from, what the state is saying about our bodies, what like the company is demanding for like my time and also my ability to conform with certain ideals, and where I want to devote my intellectual energy towards in the future. And so, as we said in the beginning, our fellows theme this year is self-determination, which is a way for people to think about how they want to engage with the future. And so I hope you take away from this talk a sense of the hopefulness and empowerment in the earlier passages of Muñoz's text. Queerness is a turn towards the future. The here and now is a prison house. There's not enough in the present moment, and we need to look for alternative ways of being. And I think it's really easy for a lot of us to get caught up in the criticism of the present because there's a lot that we should be criticizing. But it's easy to also forget that we need to look beyond. But the sort of world that we want to live in, imagine or real, in the end, only comes from us through our practice of self-determination and our ability to actively forge our futures. So thank you all for coming to my talk. I will now be opening it up to questions from the audience.
Hi. Earlier you were talking about the significance of choosing books that typically aren't on syllabi. So I was wondering about the significance of syllabi making and its connection to your research project.
Yeah, so I actually spoke a lot to my advisor Piali about this because she's both a writer and a teacher. And in making a syllabus and putting someone else's text on it, you're saying, I really enjoyed reading this and I want to pass it on to my students. And so there's an added appreciation and weight to everything that you put on a syllabus. And so just in general, Asian American spaces tend to skew heterosexual and cisgender, and a lot of queer spaces tend to skew white. And I think that's something that I've sort of seen true in my engagement with Asian American communities on campus, as well as classes I've taken in the English and gender sexuality, women's studies departments. And I think for me, in choosing texts that really bridge those two worlds was to not make Asian American queerness as a side topic to talk about one day in those classes, but to really make that the core of my project. And because there are so many different stories that are able to be told that I feel there's no way you can even begin to sort of think about those narratives unless you actively research it in that way.
When you were doing your research, did you find yourself was there an emphasis on the characters or the authors, or even with yourself, of trying to grappling between the cultural expectations of being a woman or femininity in as an Asian, or and contrasting with societal contemporary ideas of being a woman in America, or whatever culture you're being translated into?
Yeah, so this didn't really come up in The Chosen and the Beautiful just because Jordan was taken from Vietnam at a very young age and was really only raised in white society. But Bestiary, for example, it takes place across Taiwan during World War II, as well as in Arkansas and California, different parts of the US. I guess Bright Lines is a text that I wasn't able to present on, but that takes place in both Brooklyn and Bangladesh. And definitely, I think that's a theme that a lot of the characters were thinking about just because they're engaging with like elders and older generations, and sort of how, like, I guess people's understanding of like their own gender and identity is like constantly evolving and changes from generation to generation. But I think a lot of them definitely really thought about how like they could make sense of it themselves on their own terms. But I think it was also really challenging because of like the legacy of family and history that a lot of the characters were also carrying with them.
I know you noted like early on that you were trying to see if you could get like, you know, a more like diverse selection of fiction works between like, you know, East Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia. And I was kind of wondering, you know, like based on the different circumstances that have led these different regions and like the people from these regions to like come to America and like, you know, the different circumstances surrounding their existence in America. I was kind of wondering like if there were anything, like any observances you noticed, like differing between these works and like differing between the regions that like the works were centered on, and like if that kind of like brought any different like dimensionality to your focus.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, a lot of these books like are transnational, so there's a lot of that like history and geopolitics of Asia that had lasting impacts. I guess both like the two books I talked about here, there are really strong legacies of imperialism that drove how the characters ended up in the US. With like Bestiary, it was during World War II in Taiwan, and there was like a lot of violence that the family experienced. And for them, like it was a migration to the US, but it was also like as a result of that kind of violence. And Jordan Baker was like taken out of Vietnam by a white missionary basically and brought to the US. And for example, in the Bangladeshi novel Bright Lines, one of the main characters was like an orphan from the war. And so like there are a lot of recurring streams of violence in Asia as being a driver for what brought a lot of these characters over to the US. But there are also a lot of narratives where these are two immigrant parents who just wanted a better life and came to the US willingly or in search of more opportunity, not necessarily because of like the geopolitics behind it. So I think that's a really good observation that like Asian America is so broad and there are so many histories involved that if I wanted to even understand it, I would need to read like very different books with very different histories.
So you talked about going to your lead books in New York and like talking to the owners of the bookstore and kind of like interacting with the community through the author debut there. I was wondering if like either when you were in New York at the bookstore or just generally when you were doing your research, if you came across like different like the different communities, whether like physical, in person or online, that like interacted with these books, and if you noted any differences in the way queer Asian women or just generally like any reader of any of these books like interacted with the text versus maybe the other non-queer, non-Asian, like contemporary version.
Yeah. Okay, I guess like in terms of the physical place, like everyone was there for the author debut, so everyone was just supportive of like all the books there and bookstores in general. I think that's like an ethos that a lot of writers share, is to be supportive of the bookstores. And I feel like because literature is like, I don't know, not a super mainstream interest or like career path that a lot of people pursue, there's like a really strong sense of community that I found where people are really willing to like help me out. Like I was talking to the owner for book selections, but next to me, like this woman turned towards me and was like, "Oh, like that project sounds really interesting. Can you talk to me more about it?" And I looked at her, and she's this writer who's the host of the podcast that I was listening to religiously during COVID, and I had like a celebrity moment. But it was just really cool to, I guess, sort of see how like welcoming that community was to like help me out with my project. And I guess in terms of like online spaces, like on Twitter, I feel like that's where I often see a lot of the up and coming books because I follow a lot of these writers. And generally, like, people are really supportive. They retweet each other's like glowing reviews. But there's also a lot of discussion about the publishing industry as a whole that is predominantly white, and that a lot of these like marginalized voices are not coming to the forefront. That I think that I guess lends to why maybe this community of like queer Asian women writers is so strong. Is because you know, like if the higher ups who sort of control what gets published or doesn't get published are not really the ones who are responding to your texts, like how else can you like elevate each other's work and make it more noticed or more seen? And yeah, I guess online platforms, they do reach a mass audience, and that's a good way, I guess, to garner visibility and like publicity.
So I wonder if there's anyone on Zoom that would like to ask a question. So if you want to invite folks from Zoom.
Would like to ask a question?
Okay, yeah. I'm always reachable by email, Instagram, DM, whatever. So if anything comes up, feel free to reach out.